So I'm going to be honest with you. I'm a multitasker. Whether it's playing games while watching another video, or sometimes reading a book while playing a game, or sometimes walking while reading. I not like listening to an audiobook, like actually physically reading. I like doing two things at once. And I think because of that, I was really interested in the science of multitasking. And I'd heard this thing that multitasking was a myth. I think the main thing that people often say is that while you might think you're doing two things at the same time, what your brain is actually doing is switching between them at a very, very fast rate, on the order of microseconds. And that is the way that you're able to concentrate on those things. Maybe you're switching between them with a bigger interval, I'm not quite sure. So I was interested to find out more. So I decided to investigate and to pick up this book, which is called The Myth of Multitasking by Dave Crenshaw. And I wanted to read this book because I wanted to find out a little bit more about the research and a little bit more about the science. And the reason is I'm actually a researcher at the moment, and one of the things that I find a lot in the research is people make claims about stuff. We can conclude that this thing is conclusively better than that thing. But if you actually look at their method, if you look at how they did their experiments and what they did, their claim is not necessarily correct given their method. I can see how that's what they are trying to achieve. They're trying to achieve a certain claim. But their method is actually only testing for something else. Big picture example, assessment, right? What do assignments or assessments at school or at university really test? A lot of teachers want to say understanding, but if you actually look at the way they structure their questions and the fact that the best preparation is usually memorizing answers, they don't actually test any understanding, and they often test a lot of memorization. So I wanted to test the test, right? I want to look at what is the method behind all these people that say multitasking is a myth. What is the good scientific, mathematical, logical reasoning for something like that? And that is not what I found with this book. This is a strong do not recommend, right? A very strong don't read this unless you want to feel angry or frustrated like me. Because I came to this book looking for science, and what I found was nonsense, absolute nonsense. So the book is really split into two parts. It's told a bit like a narrative, where the author or a author insert character is basically a consultant and is out there helping this business CEO, this woman who's leading a fashion company or something, I can't quite remember, who's always busy, always multitasking, has people interrupting her all the time and trying to answer emails and phone calls and all this kind of thing. And he's coming in, and he's basically trying to pitch or sell her a solution, right? Trying to improve her life. And he has a solution, which we'll get to a little bit later. But he sort of frames to her that the problem that she has is that she believes in multitasking. She says, I do these things at once. Isn't that great? Like a sign that I'm busy. If I didn't do that, I wouldn't be able to cope. And his belief is that multitasking doesn't exist, and that a lot of what you're doing is actually worse than if you did those tasks in sequence. That is his belief, that is her belief, and he's sort of trying to show or prove to her that. So he does a couple of things. And one of the things he does is he asks her how many times in the day she gets interrupted. And she might say, I don't know, she sees 5 people a day, and she gets 7 phone calls, and she has 3 meetings, and all this kind of thing. And he regularly schedules them throughout the day, and he finds out that she never gets more than 10 minutes of uninterrupted time before she gets a meeting or a phone call or a person or something like that. And that's totally fine, that's great. It was good that he laid it out like that. But then he said, those 5 minutes of talking to a person or a phone call or whatever, he calls those 5 minutes the switching costs of multitasking. Now, switching cost, as you can probably understand, is meant to be when you go from one task to another, you spend a little bit of time adjusting, switching between the two. That's what that idea should be. It's lost time that exists when you're working on 2 different tasks. And he says that those 5 minutes or those interruptions, they are the switching costs. But they're not the switching costs. Switching cost is comparing how much time you lose going from one task to another compared to the gain that you have of doing 2 tasks simultaneously. That should be the switching costs. You compare what happens when you do something in sequence to what happens when you do them simultaneously. Interruptions, that's not a switching cost, that's an interruption. That is still work, right? Talking to your employee is still work. Talking on the phone is still work. You're not proving to me that's a switching cost. It's not a switching cost. And it was so infuriating because he kept on making some comments. He kept on saying things like, you have switching costs. You have 5 minutes every time. That's a switching cost. That's just maths. But it's not maths, right? It was the exact opposite of maths. It was just something that he was pulling out of thin air with no basis, no evidence whatsoever. Now, I don't think I explained that particularly well, so I'll give you an example to try and illustrate it. What I think I wanted more of, and he did do once, but I think his example was so absurd it was not helpful. He got them to write out the sentence, multitasking is a myth, as well as the numbers 1 to 30 or something like that, right? And in the first go, he says, write out the word first, and then write out the sequence of numbers. And in the second attempt, he says, all right, write out the M from multitasking, and then the 1, and then the U from multitasking, then the 2, and basically switching back and forth between the two. And obviously, for an experiment like that, you expect switching back and forth between the two is going to take more time, right? You're physically moving the pen longer, you have to go back between the task and whatever. And sure enough, you time them out and they take a hilarious like double or triple the time of what the actual original exercise where they did them in sequence was. And yes, I have no doubt that that's going to be the case for that example. What I was more interested in was him doing the exact same test, the exact same experiment, or the exact same data with someone who's writing an email while being in a meeting at the same time. Say it's an hour meeting and it takes you an hour to work on that email throughout that time. If you did the back-to-back, the meeting is taking an hour regardless. The email, on the other hand, well, maybe you would have added an additional 10 minutes to the end, 20 minutes to the end, 30 minutes to the end. Would have taken an hour and a half in total that you've done in 1 hour. If someone is able to do that, I would say multitasking works and is not a myth. And that is the thing that I did not get him proving whatsoever. There was no evidence whatsoever in this book that multitasking was a myth. And that's what I was looking for. I was looking for the evidence. I wanted to read something. I wanted to be proven wrong. And I could not find it. And it was so frustrating. But there is hope, right? And it's clear that this guy is a consultant or something. And the second half of the book focuses on solutions, right? The first half is him trying to convince him of the problem, why multitasking is bad, whatever. The second half is solutions. And I actually really like the solutions part, which you might think is weird, because as engineers, we're often told you have to define the problem. You have to know what the problem is before you can then try and solve it. But I actually don't think he works in that kind of industry. I think in consulting, and I worked in consulting for a little bit, I actually don't think you need to understand the problem very well. If you have some solutions that are tried and tested, it kind of doesn't matter what the problem is. You know those solutions are effective. And he has two of those. One of them is, clearly you get a lot of interruptions from people. People come to our office and try and catch her. And sometimes she says, can this wait? And they're hesitant and they're like, all right, whatever, go ahead anyway. And he says that the reason that people are interrupting you so often is you're so busy, they don't know when they can catch you. And I think that's true. I think that's definitely true. And his solution is schedule a regular meeting time with these people so that they know if they have a non-urgent question, they can hold it until then. Now, they still may need to come in and interrupt you for really urgent things, but at least that's narrowing it down to only urgent interruptions and not non-urgent interruptions. And I agree that that would probably be an effective strategy for this boss. More regular scheduled meetings with some of her direct managers, I think, is a good thing in that case. The other thing he mentions is you don't have to be available for phone calls all the time. And he talks about some other CEO that has a voicemail that basically says, hey, I only answer phones between this time and this hour, like please call me then. And yeah, I'm sure that would be effective. I'm sure people would be trained to get used to it. And I'm sure it would help you with your day as well. So it really was a book of two halves. The first half of the book was completely frustrating because there was no evidence whatsoever that multitasking was ineffective. And yet it was the central thesis of the first half of the book. The second half of the book was a lot more relaxing because I do think his actual solutions were good, even if I think his understanding of the problem was flawed. And that's it. That's the multitasking myth. I wouldn't really recommend reading it unless you're a glutton for punishment or you really want to find out more about, how bad is this book? But I guess I'll put a link in the description or in the comments anyway. If you do read it, let me know. Did it frustrate you as much as it frustrated me? Because certainly, whenever I talk to anybody, it certainly gets my emotions up.